Well, the core planning team has the responsibility of investigating. Do actually almost the best way to explain that is investigative journalism, which is a form of uh, doing research, action research. So they gather intelligence by interviewing people, by reading relevant documentation, gathering data, gathering information, uh, and the knowledge that comes from talking to people from different walks of life. So all this is coming in front of a core planning team, which has to have attributes of uh, some of which you, Jeff Dietrich, has elaborated very well for me to understand, actually, attributes such as willingness to listen, willingness to learn, willingness to make commitments about what will happen to a group that will come together to address a triggering question and to explore a generic question. So fundamentally, the core planning team has to immerse, it's an immersion process. They immerse themselves to all this intelligence gathering, all the stuff that they have uh, gathered from interviews, from documentation, and they explore through, again, successive approximations, the framing of both the triggering question and the generic question. They are different because the triggering question is a question that triggers people. That's why it's called triggering. It's supposed to really trigger people to generate ideas. And if it's framed appropriately and it triggers people and people can internalize it, that's why it's also extremely important at the start of the collab to clarify this triggering question, to make sure that everybody understands it and becomes co-owners of that triggering question and they internalize it. The generic question is different because it's not a matter of generation, it's a matter of exploring the connections, making connections, and connecting the ideas that have been generated by the triggering question. And the connections are non-trivial because the complexity, the situational complexity is strongly dependent on the number of connections. So if, for example, the generic question is not reasonably understood by the group, they can find that everything is related to everything else, in which case you get a maximum complexity, you can get a complete vicious cycle, and that might be the case. If it is the case, it should be all right. I mean, we can have a group generate a vicious cycle. Actually, the first time I worked with Native Americans in 1987, the first application of SDD with a group of Native American tribal leaders gave the greatest complexity I ever experienced. It was a vicious cycle. So, but then it was the case. They were in a vicious cycle, those tribes, and then we worked with them and progress was made. So the generic question can generate a virtuous, it can generate a vicious cycle, which is actually the case, or it can generate a vicious cycle which is spurious. It's not the right one. So the facilitator has to be sensitive to how help the group understand the generic question, and also that's where the dashboard of the Logosophia is extremely important. And thanks to you, to Jeff Dietrich, this dashboard has been design and incorporate in Logosophia, because without knowledge, by knowing how the deliberation unfolds in terms of the connections that are being generated by exploring, by applying actually the generic questions, if the facilitator has knowledge of what is happening, then the facilitator has the capacity to manage the deliberation or the speed of the deliberation in order not to generate spurious connections. That was connections that are not necessarily the connections that should exist. And again, that's why the dashboard is extremely important, and the good facilitator should be watching the dashboard, seeing the number of connections, seeing the levels of the structure of the map, and by managing that appropriately, determining whether the deliberation about using the generic question, which is different from the generation of ideas, we are now deliberating about the connections to making sure that these are meaningful deliberations and meaningful connections.